Good morning, everyone. I generally do not preach or preach much on Palm Sunday. Maybe just a few words. The reading of the Passion that we hear today, it's so long, and I figure that that Passion, that gospel story, it speaks for itself. But today is different, and since we haven't just finished standing up for 15 minutes listening to that gospel, I thought I'd take a few minutes to share some thoughts with you and to greet you today, since I can't greet you personally. I've got some pussy willows here, thanks to Susie Cahill, who put them in the planter box. I grabbed them out of them this morning. I'll put them back. But I saw them, and they reminded me of another parish that I was at. So I was at a parish for some years in the city that was a German ethnic parish, and so we still had a Mass in German every Sunday throughout most of the years that I was there. And on Palm Sunday, the Germans always brought with them, they didn't bring palms, they brought with them pussy willows. And I remember it struck me as so odd the first time I saw them, and I asked them, why are you using pussy willows instead of palms? And they said back in Germany, they were ethnic Germans who lived outside of Germany, and then were persecuted after the war because they were ethnic Germans. Anyways, they said back in those days they couldn't get palms, and they just weren't available. First of all, they're not native to that area, but so they had to find something, and so they used pussy willows on Palm Sunday instead of palms because that was all they could get. They had to make do. The situation was different, and so they had to just make do with the circumstances that they had. Palms or pussy willow. Whether you use one or the other, what this is intended to remind us of is when Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So remember, this Mass usually starts off with a blessing of palms and a short gospel reading of the scene when Jesus, after he'd finished his ministry throughout the Holy Land, he made his way into Jerusalem, and it was a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. People were like waving these palms. It was a way of greeting the king who really did come as a king. Remember, he was riding on a donkey, and people were laying their cloaks, and they were laying palm branches on the ground so that the donkey could walk in on a carpet of palm branches and on a carpet of palms. This triumphal scene quickly turns to tragedy. It's amazing how quickly things can change, from uproarious joy to intense sadness. Sound familiar? The gospel reading, the Passion, is a long one. This is our book of the Gospels. In the book of the Gospels, we usually break it into parts, but if we were to just read this, 10 pages, folks. It's a long one. But instead of standing and listening to it be read this year, what do you say we all make the effort to read it ourselves at home? It's Matthew's Gospel. It starts in chapter 26 and then runs basically almost till the end. 26 through partway through chapter 27. This passage, it's meant to be swallowed whole. Even though there's metaphorically an awful lot to chew on in this passage, it's a long piece, and it's meant to be heard, it's meant to be taken in all at once. While these stories, they're real stories of things that happened in real history, there are elements of these stories that are connected with our own lives and our own experiences today. Obviously, there's a connection between the passion of Jesus, between his suffering and the suffering going on in the world today due to this coronavirus, huh? There's suffering of those who are themselves sick. There's the suffering of those who are caring for the sick. There's the suffering of those who are most worried about contracting it, worried about, what if I get it? What's it going to do to me? And there's the suffering for most of us who perhaps seems like it's not anything compared with somebody who's got the illness and is in the hospital. But there is suffering for those of us whose lives have in many ways been put on hold for the next month. You know, the 40 days of Lent calls to mind the 40 days that the Israelites were wandering in the desert after they had been freed from their bondage, from their slavery in Egypt. And this thought went through my head. I was thinking about how were they released from that bondage in Egypt? It was those plagues, remember? And that last plague, remember how they had to stay in their homes until the angel of death passed by. Kind of feels like that, doesn't it? We're all staying in our homes. We're aware that there seems to be this angel of death out there, and so we're staying in our homes while that passes by. Of course, ours is not a situation where God is actively inserting himself into our world, causing disruption and death. You know, theologians talk about this in terms of the permissive will of God. That's the technical term. It's a it's a concept theologically that's too dense to really get into a lot here. But in short, it acknowledges that nothing happens in the universe without God's allowing it to happen, right? Otherwise, God wouldn't be all-powerful, all-knowing. Even if God hates the effects. So there are plenty of things that go on in this world that God does not like, that God hates. We know that God allows human evil to flourish where it does because God created us with free will. So if I do something that hurts another person, God allows that. It's not God's will that I do that, but he permits it because he's given me free will. Now, what's more difficult is trying to make sense of natural disasters, and this would qualify as a natural disaster, this situation that we're in. Now, I'm not going to let God off the hook. But at the same time, we've come to see over the centuries that God's ways are not our ways. That God has a grasp of the big picture, God has a grasp of the big picture that we can never hope to really comprehend in our lives, in this life at least. And so God's response to human suffering is to point us to the cross, Somehow as we unite ourselves with Jesus and his suffering and death, we're drawn into the mystery of God's love. It's a love for us. God's love for us is a love that is stronger than death, even though God suffered death. I'm going to hold this up and show you something on this processional crucifix that we have. I talk about this sometimes with the kids in school, and you see Jesus' hand there, and you can see that he's got 3 fingers together and then the 2 fingers sticking out. That's certainly not the way a normal hand would be if it was crucified. That's actually a theological representation. And the thought is that Jesus on the cross, even though he's dead, he continues to preach. The 2 fingers together represent Jesus' humanity and his divinity. And the 3 fingers together, sometimes it's the thumb, I think in this case it is, represents the Trinity. So we've got here on the cross Jesus represented it just having died, but still preaching. That this isn't just anyone who died on the cross. This is part of the Trinity, and that part of the Trinity had 2 natures, right? A human nature and a divine nature. And in a mysterious way that obviously we can't really understand. We'll maybe focus this a little bit more on Good Friday. But when the second person of the Trinity, who's taken on our human nature, got crucified, it opened up something new for us. Somehow it gave us not just a glimpse, but an experience of God's powerful love for us, even in a world that sometimes feels like it's turning upside down. I just want to say a word to any children who might be watching this today. You know, kids, we are experiencing something very unusual right now. Not just the fact that your sports are canceled and your school's canceled and you've got to spend so much time at home, but it's unusual for you probably to see adults in your lives feeling uncertain kind of about the way things are going. I mean, look, we are working very hard to endure this for what they say is a small percentage of people for whom this is a dangerous time. And so our staying at home as we are, our keeping away from others, this is our gift to them. It's a gift that they deserve. For us to stay at home and to stay healthy so that we do not spread this illness. I want you to know I'm thinking about you, and I understand how difficult this sometimes is and how unfair that it probably seems sometimes. You know, friends, when we celebrate Palm Sunday at church and we read that story of the Passion, we are not left wallowing at the foot of the cross, right? We're not left wallowing at the sealed up tomb. Because right after we read the Passion, we move right to the altar. We move to the liturgy of the Eucharist, where we encounter the risen Christ sacramentally in the sacrament. So we're not left here on Sundays, are we? Because we encounter Christ risen from the dead. We know how the story ends. But we don't have that same opportunity this year, as you know. But I want you to remember that the risen Christ is also present sacramentally in each one of you. Through your baptism, you were mystically united to him. He is present sacramentally in all of those around you who've been baptized. Sure, the Eucharist joins us to Jesus in his death and resurrection, but our baptism does too. Friends, I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you. We've got a long month or so ahead of us still, I know, so let's do our part to make this the best month we can. We don't get to experience Holy Week together liturgically, but perhaps we're experiencing it this year in an even more profound way, perhaps in an even more personal way. And though physically separated, perhaps we might even experience this in a more communal way. May God bless you today and throughout this Holy Week. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.